Hey there guys, and welcome back. On this week's show, we're going to be making a picture frame. Well, now I know that you guys have seen me make a picture frame before, and it's really nothing special, but this week's is a little different, and I thought you might be able to join me and try it for yourself and see how it works out. Now, if you joined me on last week's show, you would have made one of these, and what that is a jig for drawing an ellipse, and that's going to play a big part in what this frame build is, due to the fact that we are actually going to try to duplicate this frame. And if you're not sure what this frame is, this would be my wedding photo from, well, almost 26 years ago. And we've taken an updated photo of ourselves in that exact same house, in the exact same corner, and my wife would like the frame duplicated. And that is what we're going to do. And if you notice there, you notice the ellipse in the middle of that picture frame, which basically frames out the photo. So the first thing we're going to do is choose our stock, and for this I'm going to use walnut, and we're going to want it to be 3/4 of an inch thick.
Well, all of my projects start off with rough cut lumber, and this one is no exception. Starting off with some 8/4 walnut, it all starts off at the jointer planer to get perfectly flat face and the perfectly 90-degree perpendicular surface on the edge. From there it's over to the bandsaw, where we're going to resaw this to a much thinner piece, just leaving a little bit of extra material on the thickness in order to be able to run it through the thickness planer, which would be our next step. I'm doing this at a slower speed, at more of a finishing speed for the DeWalt 735, and we're going to bring it down to its final thickness of 3/4 of an inch.
Well, now that you've got your rough stock milled down to your 3/4 of an inch thick, we need to cut the width of our pieces, and for that, and for this particular frame, we're going to need the pieces to be 3 inches wide. The whole frame is going to be 8.5 by 11 inches outside dimensions, but we need the 3-inch wide slats in order to be able to mark that elliptical cutout in the middle. So take your pieces over to the table saw and cut some 3-inch wide strips. Well, now that we have the stock cut to our 3 inches wide, we need to cut the rabbet in these pieces that is going to accept the glass, the backer board, the picture, etc. And what we're going to want to do here is on the edge of this piece, we want to leave a 1/2 inch of untouched material. So basically the rabbet is going to be 2.5 inches wide. Now, that may seem extreme to you, but a lot of that material is going to get cut away when the ellipse is drawn onto the frame. So 2.5 inch wide, we're going to go half the thickness of our material here, which is 3/8 of an inch deep will be our halfway point. So your rabbet of 2.5 inches by 3/8 of an inch deep, and we're going to do that at the table saw.
Well, the first pass is made with the blade set at a height of 2.5 inches and the fence set so that the cut will leave 3/8 of an inch of material on each one of these pieces of walnut. The fence is then adjusted to be at the 1/2 inch mark, and the blade height is set at 3/8, and with one pass, our rabbet for each of the pieces is finished. Now that all the rabbets are cut, you want to take each one of your pieces for the frame, set your miter fence at 45 degrees, and just cut one end of each one of the frame pieces. Now, due to that extra long rabbet, I've had to change my fence over to the opposite side of the blade to cut the opposite 45-degree angle in order to get all the pieces we need.
And with that, now we have our pieces of the frame cut. And I know it looks a little odd, like what's with this great big shelf here? I mean, what kind? But again, we're going to be cutting that ellipse out of here. So the only thing you can really do at this point in time is to glue this frame up in your frame clamp if you have one. If not, you can use 45-degree clamps with a band around it, that sort of thing. There's all kinds of ways to clamp up a frame. I'm going to be using my frame clamp, and I'm going to let this dry up. There's nothing more that you can do with this until this whole assembly is glued together and dried. But I will caution you to make sure that you clean up all of the squeeze out here to make your joints nice and clean all the way around. And with that, our frame is glued together, and at this point in time, there's really not much that we can do with it. I've cleaned up all the squeeze out. You can probably see it's still a little wet down in these areas here, but that'll dry out. It may raise the grain a bit, but we're going to sand it anyway. I'm okay with that. So for now, there's not much that we can do other than just to leave this alone and let it dry up. And I guess I'll leave it overnight, and I'll see you tomorrow. Well, it's the next day, and I've given the frame a complete sanding on the flat surfaces and obviously unclamped it. Now, I'm not a fan of leaving my frames with just the strength of a glue joint, so what we're going to do next is take it over to the table saw and cut some slots to install some splines.
Now I'm cutting the spline grooves using a shop-made spline jig here, and you'll want to make sure, because the edges of the frame are only a ½ inch thick, you want to make sure that your blade height is not so high that you're going to cut through that and into the area where the glass is held. Now you may have just noticed that I cut the one corner of the frame and then rotated the frame and cut the exact same corner. The reason for that is that I set the fence so that the blade is roughly in the center of the frame stock, and by rotating it like that and cutting the same piece but just on the opposite side on the same corner, I'm actually ensuring that the groove for the spline is in the exact center of the board.
Those of you that have seen my builds before know that I'm a big fan of contrasting wood, and I especially like installing contrasting splines. However, in this particular case, I'm reproducing an existing frame, and the splines are strictly structural in this case and not a decorative aspect. So you just want to fine-tune your splines with a little bit of hand sanding. That way they're not too loose, not too tight. You want them to be firm, but you don't want to have to jam them in there and hammer them in place. You want to be able to push them and hold them in place just with your finger pressure, just like that. And then we'll clean up the squeeze out just to make the cleanup a little later much easier. So glue in all your splines. And there's plenty that we can do while waiting for these splines to dry up. But for that, you're going to need your ellipse drawing jig. Well, I have the ellipse jig here on the frame, and I've centered it on the frame, making sure that the upper axis is drawing correctly and the side axis, you wouldn't want to have it reversed and have it drawing the ellipse the wrong way. But using a square here, what I've done is I'm just making sure that everything is lined up and that it's square to the frame, and I've got a little bit of double-sided tape there to hold it in place for me while I draw this ellipse. Now, one of the ways that I used here to make sure that this was centered, and just to make it a little easier for myself, is I measured the width of the frame, subtracted the width of the jig here, and divided that number by 2, and that gives you the distance from the edge of the frame to the ellipse drawing jig. then I just set up one of these little squares. You could use a combination square just the same way. Set it for that distance that you calculated here, and you're very quickly able to sit it right beside on the edge of the frame and make sure that it's exactly centered. You can do the same thing on this end. It's a very quick way to set it, and then use a square to make sure that it's set to the edge. Well, now that we've got this in place, I'm going to sharpen my pencil to make sure that I get a good clean edge and a good clean line, and we're going to draw our ellipse on our frame, but we're not going to cut it yet. I just want to show you before I move on here exactly how perfect and crisp and clean, and it is a perfect ellipse. I mean, this jig does a fantastic job, and it's just my opinion, it would be a fantastic addition to any of your shops. Well, on the original frame, there is this routed decorative groove. It is not an inlay, it's just a routed groove. So my wife had said, no, don't worry about that, don't put that in. She just wanted the shape of the frame. But I know that she really wants pretty much a replica of this frame, just a smaller version of it. So I'm going to attempt to make this routing. And the only way I can really think of to duplicate this is going to be to make a template and use a guide in my trim router with my 1/16 inch straight bit. It's going to be a little bit of a nerve-wracking experience trying to get that done, but I'm willing to try it, and hopefully it's going to work out. So what we're going to start off with is a piece of 1/4 inch hardboard, and we're going to start drawing out the lines that we're going to need to make this template. Well, what you just watched there was the maiden voyage and the test of the pattern or the template here for routing of that detail that I spoke of on the frame. And I wouldn't run it on the original project without first doing a test run on this little piece of plywood. And I'll just give this a light sanding here, but from what I can see, I don't know if you can see it, it's not exact to the original, but it is pretty darn close, and I think it'll be perfect actually. So I think I'm going to suck it up, be brave, and attach our template to the original and route it out. We'll just check it actually before. I was just going to pop that template off, but we just want to check it around to make sure that we've got a full route all the way. And yes, it looks good. So just going to give this a little pop off of here. I used about 1.5 miles of double-sided tape because I really didn't want to chance this thing moving while I was routing. I mean, you only get one shot at it when you're routing on the actual project, and when you're the human CNC, you really don't want to take the chance that it moves. You know what, I'm not going to waste any more filming time popping this off. It's obviously giving me a hard time. I'm going to get this thing off of here, and I'll come back and show you the results after I give it a light sanding. And with that detail routed, you can see it's nice and clean, it's crisp, I really like it. I think that's going to make her happy because that's one of the details that mimics the original frame. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take this frame over to the scroll saw and I'm going to cut this ellipse that we drew. I'm going to cut it to just outside of the line because we're going to use an oscillating drum sander to sand up to the line to make it perfect as we can. I'm also going to cut these splines off now because they're nice and dry and we can sand those flush as well. And there we have our oval sanded and of course cut, and everything is looking great as far as I'm concerned. What we need to do now is some round overs. So I'm going to go through my router bits and see. I'm thinking maybe a 1/4 inch round over around the inside of the oval and potentially a 1/4 inch round over around the outer edges. And that would probably be it for this frame other than some sanding. So let's get those round overs finished. There you have it. A custom picture frame. Guys, this is a different way to make a frame. It almost is like making the mat that you would use for the picture part of the frame. And there's nothing wrong with that. Thinking outside the box is a great thing, especially when you're talking about working in the shop and doing woodworking projects. So we started off with the smoke grinder. The smoke grinder, of course, turned into the ellipse drawing jig, and the ellipse drawing jig, of course, turned into a custom frame for my wife so that she could have the old version right next to the smaller but 25, 26 year later version, reproduction sort of thing. Guys, I hope you've enjoyed this show. I hope that you're going to give this a try yourself, because making custom picture frames is not as simple, or doesn't have to be as simple as 45s, glue them together and throw in some glass and a photo. You can do a lot more outside of this, including, like I've done here, with custom routing templates for design features, as well as ellipses to frame out your photos in a way that's outside of the norm, that's a little bit different. Guys, I hope you're going to try some of these methods yourself. I hope that you've enjoyed this week's show, and more importantly, I hope that you're going to join me next week for yet another woodworking video.